This video is designed to be a guide. Please note that other complications may exist that aren't addressed in this guide. While we always strive to provide accurate and detailed information, we can't guarantee that it will fix your TV's issues. Shop Jimmy is not responsible for any harm that you may cause to yourself or damage to your TV during the repair process. Try all repairs and troubleshooting at your own risk. Be sure to take all the proper safety precautions. In this video, we will show how to install a component repair kit for the board number BA4GU5G0201. This board number is present in many different mainboard SKUs, as well as many different TV model numbers. You can see a full list in the video's description. Here are the board locations for the components in the kit. These locations are also included with the kit when you purchase it from shopjimmy.com. The symptoms that this repair kit can fix are if you have a dead set, if you have standby but the TV will not turn on, or if you have a chirping noise coming from the power supply. Here's an example of what the chirping noise sounds like. To help speed up the process for the video, we are using a preheater underneath the board to help heat up the components faster. I will start by hovering my hot air tool over the IC, moving it back and forth over all sides to heat it up evenly in order to remove it. Use a tweezers to grab hold of one of the legs and gently pull the IC from the board once it is loose. Clean up the pads using a solder iron and wick. Clean up the pads with some isopropyl alcohol and a brush. Add a few drops of solder paste on the pads underneath the IC. After putting down the solder paste, I will turn back on my preheater. Line up the IC in the proper position. Line up pin 1 on the IC with the pin 1 placement info on the board. I will hover the hot air tool above the IC and slowly heat it up until the solder paste melts underneath the IC. Allow the IC to cool in place before soldering the legs to the board. Take a flux pen and run it along the first side of the IC that will be soldered. Add a very small amount of solder to your iron and then run the tip over the legs of the component. You may need to run the tip over the legs multiple times. It is very important that you do not use too much solder. Be sure you do not have any solder bridges. Here is what a solder bridge looks like. If you do have a solder bridge and you cannot remove it with just the iron, you may need to use some wick to remove the solder and then smooth it back out with the iron. Repeat the same process for each side of the IC. Use some isopropyl alcohol and a brush to clean up the component. The next component we are going to show how to replace is this IC. I will hover again with the hot air tool around the component and use my tweezers to remove it from the board. Use the solder wick and iron to clean up the pads. Use some isopropyl alcohol and a brush to clean up the pads. Get the pin on the IC lined up correctly. Line up pin 1 on the IC with the pin 1 placement info on the board. Hold the IC in position with the tweezers. Then run the flux pen over the legs of the IC and then add a little bit of solder to the tip of your iron and run it over the legs. Repeat the same process on the other side. Then, once done, clean up the legs with some isopropyl alcohol and a brush. I will heat up and remove the 5 capacitors and 1 diode on the front side of the board in this area. Clean up the pads with solder wick and an iron. Then clean up the pads with some isopropyl alcohol and a brush. Put down solder paste on all of the pads. Place each of the components on the pads. One by one, hover the hot air tool over each component and budge it into position with the tweezers. You may see some of the components nearby move around. Just be sure to get them all back into place if this happens. This diode must be aligned correctly on the board. There is a white line or lines on the diode. In order to see these, you may need to use a flashlight and magnifying glass. Line up the white line or lines with the white line on the board to be sure that the diode is aligned correctly. Then, once done, clean up with some isopropyl alcohol and a brush. Next, I will replace the other two capacitors on the front side of the board using the same process. Then I will flip the board over and replace the 4 capacitors on the back side of the board using the same process as the other 7 that we just did.